Hi everyone, and welcome back to another exciting lecture in logic and critical thinking. In this lecture, lecture 11, we'll take a look at induction fallacies. So we'll continue our discussion in this section, section 4, the final section of the course. We'll continue our discussion of fallacies, this time again taking a look at fallacies or mistakes in reasoning associated with inductive reasoning or inductive types of arguments, right? So we'll say more about that here in a moment. So then, much like we did in the previous lecture, lecture 10, when we talked about relevance fallacies, we'll basically then go through and offer a catalog, more or less, of all the various ways you can make mistakes in the process of coming to an inductive conclusion, right? Or all the ways you can make mistakes when you're engaged in that inductive reasoning process. So again, this is going to, as we'll see, talk more about, I should say, reflect all the things we talked about in chapter 11 or in lecture 6 when we discussed inductive reasoning, right? So we discussed the process of inductive arguments and inductive reasoning in that lecture and in that chapter as well. And so again, the idea is here, we'll turn our attention to all the different kinds of ways you can make mistakes in that process. Okay, so that's really what we're up to here. There's nothing too overly complex. Again, I think if there's anything difficult about any of these lectures or any of the material in this final section, it's just the sheer volume of the different types of mistakes we'll be talking about. But again, practice, 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 I think helps with that. And in terms of practice, I did want to mention while I'm thinking about it, with respect to your homework, unlike the previous chapter where it lined up perfectly with our major headings, or at least the way I'm going to present it, there's not a perfect matchup, so to speak, this time around, although it's almost similar, pretty similar. So again, what we're going to be doing is offering a catalog of the various ways you can make mistakes when you're engaged in inductive reasoning. And so again, going back to the exercises, this is on pages 225 and 226 where again, the idea is you're given a whole slew of various expressions, and then your objective is to identify the kind of mistake that we're talking about here that best applies them. And so you'll notice that they combine what I call, or what they also call hasty generalization and bias generalization. They combine these two as an option in the homework under A, right? And then they offer accident as B, where as I mentioned in the course schedule, you needn't worry about accident. I don't like what they presented there, and so we're going to skip that and not worry about that. So that option B for the homework you can altogether just eliminate, right? And so then most of them then line up past that point. So they combine these two. They also combine these two. So I give very specific instructions in the homework and course schedule, right, that I want you to differentiate these two, right? So don't just tell me A, you need to tell me which one in the homework, right, which one it is. And then similarly, even though they combine post hoc and cum hoc, you need to differentiate them, right? So they label that F. Both of these fall under F in the homework. So if you identify F as being the one that best fits whichever number you're doing, then you'll need to distinguish F post hoc or F cum hoc. Okay? So hopefully that's pretty clear. But otherwise, then all the other ones seem to sort of correspond. So they have one for mistaken appeal to authority, one for mistaken appeal to popularity. They combine these two again, but then it's just slippery slope and then untestable explanation. So most of them match up, but I wanted to point out how there's not that perfect parallel with respect to how the headings that, as I'm presenting the material here, there's not that perfect parallel with then the homework headings as they present it. So I think that's all I have in terms of preliminary remarks. So we'll go ahead and just dive into the actual lecture. So turning to then slide 2, a lot of this I already intimated a moment ago, right? But why are we here? Again, we're discussing fallacies. That's what we're doing in this section. Section 4 is discussing fallacies or mistakes in reasoning. And specifically then, what are we doing here in this particular lecture, lecture 11, which again corresponds to, lecture 11, which corresponds then to chapter 7. I'm getting confused by this part. So our lecture right now, lecture 11, corresponds to chapter 7 of the text. All right, but again, we are discussing mistakes associated with inductive reasoning, which we already discussed in Lecture 6, and that corresponds to Chapter 11 of the text. So hopefully you're not overly confused by that and what we're doing, right? We're discussing that inductive stuff that we already discussed, right? That reasoning process. And then in particular, we're discussing ways that you can screw up, right? When you're trying to present an inductive argument, for example. So at the top of slide 2, as I mentioned, we're going to turn our attention to, again, fallacies, in particular, fallacies related to that inductive reasoning process, which we discussed, again, in Chapter 11 and in Lecture 6. So, as they point out on page 207 of our edition, in doing so, we take a look at, quote, fallacies of induction, which are, quote, arguments that are supposed to raise the probability of their conclusions, but are so weak as to fail almost entirely to do so, end quote. And actually, I do want to take a moment briefly here to revisit, we won't go into this at any length, but what exactly we mean by inductive reasoning, right? So what were we talking about in that lecture? Again, the idea with respect to inductive reasoning, right, it's juxtaposed with deductive reasoning, right? Inductive arguments are juxtaposed with deductive arguments. And the idea is with inductive reasoning, we're not trying to prove something is the case without fail, right? It has to be the case. No, we want to support, provide evidence for it being likely the case. And we want to support the idea that it's more than likely going to happen, right? But we're not, again, that element of necessity, certainty, which is there in deductive arguments, is not there in inductive arguments. And so, again, what we're dealing with here are mistakes associated with not the certainty type of argument, right, but the inductive, the let me try to support the conclusion, that type of argument, the inductive argument. Okay, so, again, hopefully that makes some sense there. So we're discussing mistakes specifically associated with that type of reasoning or that type of argument. So without further ado, let's go ahead then and jump into, now that we kind of have a general sense of what we're up to here, dive into then our catalog of induction fallacies. So we'll start with, turning to slide 3, hasty generalizations. So as I mentioned on the top of slide 3, this mistake reflects being overly confident in how likely a conclusion is when a small sample is involved. Okay, so one way or another, and there's all sorts of different ways that this is referenced, okay, depending on the context. But one way or another, the overriding theme here is that your conclusion is voiced much too strongly given the small sample or the number of things you're dealing with, right? It's not enough to support this much grander conclusion that you want to reach. Okay? So as they point out on page 208, it entails, quote, arriving at a general statement or rule by citing too few supporting cases. And again, some examples would probably be helpful here. So their example I liked on page 208, quote, the food in LA is lousy, judging from this meal. Again, we have too few instances upon which to make such a general, broad conclusion, right? In that example, they're making a conclusion about all the food in LA based on one meal, one person's opinion on one meal. Again, that's what we mean to indicate by a hasty generalization. And you're coming to that conclusion way too quickly. Much more investigation would be needed to arrive at least at that strong of a conclusion, or that general conclusion about all of LA's food. So as I mentioned, it's referred to as a lot of different things, kind of depending on the context. So it's also known as generalizing from too few cases, and that makes sense, right? That's the whole idea underlying the mistake here. And then I do like how the authors jokingly suggested that they'd like to see it referred to as the fallacy of the lonely fact, right? Somebody references just one point, and then they try to suggest again that it applies, because it holds true in one instance, that it applies in all these various cases. Another, one version of this fallacy, and another way we can refer to it, okay, the hasty generalization, one way it's referred to as is argument by anecdote. And in this kind of version, what's going on is, quote, it's a version of hasty generalization where the sample is just a story. That comes from page 362 of the 9th edition. And then similarly, so that's argument by anecdote. Okay, so somebody tells a story, and the authors gave some good examples, and then they come to a grand conclusion based on, I think their example there was, they gave was it John Travolta or the specific actor who did something, right? And then they then, based on that one story about what the one particular actor did, they generalized about all Hollywood actors. It was something similar to that. And again, just because John Travolta did one thing one time doesn't give you license then to infer anything about what's true about all Hollywood actors. So again, that was their example, or one of their examples, I believe, of argument by anecdote, and what we mean to indicate when we suggest somebody's guilty of that. And then similarly, we have what's known as a fallacy of small samples. So remember in investigations, back when we were talking about looking into these kinds of things and cause and effect and so on. Okay, the idea is here, if you are examining too few members of a population, okay, that's a problem, right? And it would be a problem if you then, based on that examination of these small number of the population, if you then drew a conclusion that was based on too strong based on that, right? Same sort of deal. Again, that's why it's a version of hasty generalization. Okay, you have too few members of the population. That's what I was trying to say there. You're dealing with too few members of the population to be drawing the conclusion that you are, right? That's much more broad, and you're suggesting it's true of the entire population based on an examination of too few members of the population. You need to examine more, is the idea, more members of the population to be drawing the conclusion you are. Now, if you're careful, and all of these really, if you're careful in sort of couching your conclusion, and it matches kind of, your what you're basing it on, right? And it's not couched too extreme, given your evidence or what you're looking at, then there's no mistake, right? But what happens in these instances is the conclusion is too strong, given what they're taking a look at. Okay? So, bottom of slide 3, quoting page 209, that when they talk about the fallacy of small sample, they say the fallacy of small sample is a version of hasty generalization wherein, quote, someone tries to derive a statement about all or most members of the population from a statement about a tiny sample of the population, end quote. Okay, so that was our discussion of hasty generalization. And I would say, I was kind of thinking about this as I reread the chapter. I mean, whether or not you identify a mistake as a particular type of mistake ultimately isn't a huge deal, right? What we want to be able to do is recognize that there is a mistake, okay? And similarly, whether or not you identify it as a fallacy of small sample or one of these other versions, or you want to call it this or that, right? By and large, what really matters is that you identify it, right, in the first place as being a mistake. Hey, they are guilty of a hasty generalization, okay, in one shape or form. Whatever we want to call it, there's a mistake being made here. So I just wanted to emphasize that. So the next type of mistake we'll discuss with respect to inductive reasoning is when somebody draws, again, a conclusion about, let's say, all the members of a population based on examining a particular sample. Not only is it, so that wouldn't be a problem, right? We have to examine oftentimes just a sample of the population. We can't examine all members of the population. The problem is it's not random. And we talked about all the issues associated with if the sample isn't random in lecture 6. So go back and revisit that if you need a refresher. All right. So the problem is the sample in this instance, when there's this mistake going on, the problem is the sample certainly isn't random, and it's said to be biased, right? So again, some examples will probably help here. The way they put it from 210, this is at the top of slide 4, someone's guilty of this type of fallacy. So someone who is guilty of this type of fallacy arrives, quote, at a general statement or rule by citing an atypical supporting case. And then they say, this is from the 9th edition, page 362. It entails, quote, overestimating the strength of an argument based on a biased or non-representative sample, end quote. And that's the key here, is that one way or another, the sample that we're dealing with is not representative of the whole. Okay? And that's ultimately what we're after whenever we want to draw conclusions about the population, is a representative sample. Again, we discussed that at length in lecture 6. Okay? And so what we're getting with a biased sample is the opposite of that. Okay? It's going to be slanted and skewed in certain respects. That's why, by definition, it's biased. So one version of this, as I mentioned kind of in the middle of slide 4, is known as the self-selection fallacy, which, quote, happens when someone generalizes incautiously from a self-selected sample, end quote. So this is from 211. Sort of adding to that from the 10th edition, page 379, that is, it occurs, quote, when we overestimate the probability of a conclusion derived from a self-selected sample, end quote. So, in other words, let me give you an example. So this is a perfect example, I think, in my mind, of if you were to draw a conclusion from this sort of thing. You should always be on guard when, and they sort of suggest this, right, when it comes to polls. Always be on guard against the conclusions taken from polls, especially when there's self-selected samples involved. In other words, consider, for example, that there's a poll in a gun magazine, asking people to respond and sort of give their views on what would be the word, gun restrictions and restricting the Second Amendment and so on. All right, and let's say somebody then viewed the results of this poll, and hey, you can draw certain conclusions from such a poll, but it's all about how you word those conclusions. How strong are those conclusions? And they better not be very strong at all if you're dealing with a poll that has a self-selected sample that's dealing with that issue that comes from a gun magazine. Obviously, the people that are responding, first of all, they're reading gun magazines in the first place. Right? So if somebody were to draw a conclusion, for example, that based on that, and let's say the results were they were strongly in favor of retaining the Second Amendment, not infringing on gun rights at all as they stand, not changing the status quo, and so on. That was the result of this particular survey or poll in the gun magazine. Let's say somebody then saw that and they said, hey, did you hear that Americans are in favor of yada, yada, yada? That's way too strong a conclusion, right? Generalizing from that to Americans in general, right? Because again, that was a self-selected sample. They are reading gun magazines in the first place, right? So they're skewed in that sense. They're already more than likely to be defenders of gun rights, let's say in this example, right? So hopefully you can kind of see why that presents an issue and a problem. And I think that happens a lot of times when it comes to polls and surveys. So we really need to be on guard as critical thinkers when it comes to whatever conclusions someone's drawing from polls and surveys. We need to investigate further and make sure, in those instances that we're not dealing with that those polls and surveys, they had random samples, right? That we're not dealing with self-selected samples. Okay. So, and that's their point, citing page 366 of the 9th edition at the bottom of slide 4. Always remember that, quote, no poll should be trusted if the members of the sample are there by their own choice. Okay, so we discussed bias generalization in general, and then we discussed kind of one version of that, or one way it's labeled, you might say. So we'll mark that off the list. Next, we'll discuss weak analogy. We discussed arguments by analogy again in lecture 6. And so here we're discussing mistakes associated with those types of arguments. And basically what we mean by a weak or a false analogy, as they say from 212, this, quote, is a weak argument based on debatable or unimportant similarities between two or more things. So, in other words, it signals a problem with an argument by analogy. And again, I enumerated all the various ways you can kind of attack the analogy or attack an argument from analogy that someone's given us. And one way or another, if the idea is the analogy is no good because it has very weak similarities, it's not addressing strong dissimilarities, so on and so forth, then we would label it, right? We would identify this sort of mistake and label it as a weak analogy. So hence, the middle of slide 5, the conclusion of an argument from analogy is either too strongly stated or, quote, the terms of an analogy are so dissimilar, or at least not similar enough, that the analogy cannot serve its intended purpose. Again, that's from 362 of the 9th edition. They give you an example on 212 of our edition. This is a quote, my mom is just like Adolf Hitler. I doubt she will let me go out with you guys, end quote. Okay, that's a very weak analogy. So imagine an example I was thinking of as well. Somebody saying, my logic instructor is wearing a white shirt with stripes, and that dude is wearing a white shirt with stripes. Therefore, he must be a logic instructor. Okay? If somebody were to offer us that as an argument by analogy in support of the idea that he's a logic instructor, that would be terrible, right? We would identify that as a weak analogy precisely because, again, the similarity referenced between the guy we know is a logic instructor and that dude over there is not relevant. Okay, having a shirt with stripes on it, that's not relevant to whether someone is a philosophy instructor or a logic instructor. Right, so we would immediately, hopefully, right, we would immediately identify that as a weak analogy. Okay, so that is that one. Next, we'll discuss mistaken appeal to authority. So this is turning to slide 6. As I mentioned at the top there on slide 6, the general theme here is that this person is supporting, and we're dealing with, in general here, let's erase this. Give us a little bit of room here. And I, again, apologize for how much stuff's on the board, but I do like having the entire catalog, so to speak, up there and visible at the same time. So, again, the idea is we're dealing with an inductive argument with however many premises. We'll just say 1 here. And they're offering this supposed evidence as support, reason to believe this is probably going to be the case. Not necessarily, that would be deductive, right? But probably, right, it lends us good reason to think this is more than likely going to follow them. Okay. And so the deal here is when we have a mistaken appeal to authority, their evidence, right, is faulty in the sense that they're appealing to a source that's no good, right, as evidence in this case. Okay. So again, the general thing with respect to this kind of fallacy, as I mentioned on top of slide 6, is that a person is supporting, not really, that's why it's in quotes there, right, his or her conclusion by appealing to an insufficient source. So quoting page 213 of our edition, that is, quote, he or she tries to support a contention by offering as evidence the opinion of a non-authoritative source, end quote. And by that we just mean one that's not relevant here and not good enough here. Then later on 213 they say, quote, one of the most common occurrences of mistaken appeal to authority occurs when an authority in one field, domain, or discipline is assumed without further ado to be an authority in an unrelated field, domain, or discipline, end quote. And I would agree with them. That happens all the time, right? We revere someone's credentials, right? They've made it pretty far in life in their profession or whatever, and then we automatically sort of endorse their opinions on all these other issues that are nevertheless unrelated to their area of expertise. And that's what we mean here, right, by suggesting this is a kind of mistake. Okay? Just because they have a great reputation in their own area of expertise doesn't mean that we should be endorsing their views on any other matters. So I'll give you an example there at the bottom. Again, slide 6. Dr. Diddly-Do insists that the investment opportunities our financial advisor recommended we jump on will not be profitable in the end. I'm inclined to agree with him, that is Dr. Diddly-Do, given how great his philosophy classes were. You remember how amazing Intro to Philosophy was, right? So here, not only is he just jumping on board with whatever his amazing philosophy instructor suggested, right? He's doing so against the advice of someone who actually is an expert in the area that's relevant, right? So a great example. This is actually my own example, right? Great example of a mistaken appeal to authority there. No matter how great those philosophy instructors are, you can't go endorsing all their beliefs all the time. Okay, so that was a mistaken appeal to authority. We'll move on then to mistaken appeal to popularity, and we'll have a few slides here because there are a few different versions that we'll get into and differentiate. So here, again, a mistake. What's offered as evidence isn't any good. Again, that's the problem. The person in this case is, in one way or another, in general, their evidence is just pointing to the fact that everyone's on board with it, or that everyone does it, or everyone believes it. Okay, so the idea is, well, hey, this is popular, therefore you should also believe it or do it or whatever, right? Just that in itself, just because this is popular, isn't itself evidence for jumping on board with it. So, as I mentioned at the top of slide 7, it's also known as mistaken appeal to common belief, and argument in quotes there, from popularity. Again, we're not actually dealing with an argument here. It's a pseudo argument. Okay? They don't actually offer us good evidence. That's why it's a mistake. It's a fallacy. So anytime in labeling the fallacy, there's argument in there, and it's always in quotes because there's actually not an argument there. So you could call it an argument from popularity, or again, mistaken appeal to popularity. Call it whatever you want. Again, the most important thing is you're identifying that there is a mistake here. So as they kind of characterize it in the 10th edition, page 197, quote, when we urge someone to accept a claim or fall prey to someone's doing it to us simply on the grounds that all or most or some substantial number of people, other than authorities or experts, of course, believe it. And that's when this then takes place or applies. So, quoting 214 from our edition, the 13th edition, in general, when this fallacy happens, quote, a speaker or writer treats an issue that cannot be settled by public opinion as if it can. So imagine my example here. How can you not believe in God? After all, over 90% of Americans do. So the idea is you should believe in God. And what's their evidence or reason for thinking that? Over 90% of Americans do. Again, just citing its popularity, right, isn't evidence in itself to take that position. And so that was our general discussion of mistaken appeal to popularity. Turning to slide 8, we'll then discuss mistaken appeal to common practice or mistaken appeal to tradition. It's kind of the same version of mistaken appeal to popularity, and how it's referenced depends on kind of the context, as I allude to on slide 8 here. So I'll just start with the quote then. This is the second kind of bullet point, if you will. This is from 215 of the 13th edition. The fallacy occurs when someone tries, quote, to justify a practice on the grounds that it is traditional or is commonly practiced, end quote. So you can see why it's a version of appeal to popularity, right? It is appealing to the idea that, hey, this is common, right? It's always been the case, right? It's traditional. And so that's why it's under this heading. And I give you some examples then of what we mean by a mistaken appeal to common practice or a mistaken appeal to tradition. So what we might call a mistaken appeal to common practice would be something like, this is the second one up from the bottom. I shouldn't get a speeding ticket, officer, because everyone speeds on this road, even cops. And well, look, so the mistake here, right, is they're trying to suggest I shouldn't get a ticket, and their evidence is I shouldn't get a ticket for speeding on. So their position is I shouldn't get a ticket for speeding on this road. Their evidence is no one else gets, right? Everyone speeds, or I should say, everyone speeds on this road. Well, look, just because everyone does it, okay, it's common practice doesn't mean it's okay for you to do it. And you can see then how you could also identify this as true wrongs make it right, which we discussed in the last lecture. Just because they're doing it, he or she or all of them are doing it, doesn't mean it's okay for you to do it. And we could also then label it, as is the case here, as a mistaken appeal to common practice. You can't just cite the fact that everyone else commonly does it as then evidence for why you should be able to do it. Or at least you need to suggest why that's the case. And then an example of mistaken appeal to tradition, or what we might refer to as mistaken appeal to tradition. This is one I have oftentimes thought about, and I think a lot of us at one time or another in our lives probably think about, So I've discussed this with people at various points, Santa Claus, and telling children that, they're sort of facilitating this, a lie, really a deception. You might, how do you want to put it? White lie, however you want to put it, right? It's some degree of deception, and so I've always been one to kind of pride myself on being completely transparent, and as much as possible, at least. And with my kids, I've always aimed to be completely transparent and 100% honest, and so on. And so this obviously is something then that I struggle with, and because I can sympathize then with, obviously, I loved growing up and getting presents at Christmas. What kid doesn't? Most of us have great memories of Christmas, and so I can get both sides. But so in other words, so hopefully you can sympathize with this sort of tension. And I've heard people, when I'm having this discussion, well, come on, everyone's always done it, right? It's traditional, okay? And if that alone is being cited as reason for continuing the deception, or what we might call deception, that would be what we mean to indicate by mistaken appeal to tradition. Just because everyone's always done it in the past doesn't mean that we should continue to do it. okay? And suggesting that is a mistake. Okay, if it was the case that we should always just continue to do what's been traditional, then we'd still be engaged in slavery, burning people, etc., right? So, as they mentioned in the text. So that again is an example of a mistaken appeal to tradition. So again, it's how you couch it, right? Because you might just say, you can imagine somebody having again this back and forth. Maybe you even have, like I have, exchanges or discussions about this topic, and somebody might say, and offer as evidence, well, it is traditional, and that in itself, that appeal to tradition, isn't necessarily a mistake. It again depends on what they're trying to do with it, right? And how strongly then, right, their position based on that is, right? Are they concluding too much from it? Oftentimes that is the case, and when that is the case, we'd want to throw up the red flag and say, hey, that's a mistaken appeal to tradition. Okay, so that's slide 8, and that concludes our discussion of mistaken appeal to popularity in general, and then its versions. Or actually, it doesn't. I'm sorry. We'll have one more version here. The bandwagon fallacy, which you've probably heard of. Most of us have heard of the bandwagon fallacy. Again, a version of, if you will, mistaken appeal to popularity. You probably all have a general sense of the bandwagon fallacy, and we can see why it would be under the heading of mistaken appeal to popularity. We are trying to get someone to do something, to jump on board, to behave the same way because everyone else is doing it. Again, the general theme here is, look, everyone else is doing it or believing it or thinking it, or it's always been the case, so you should too. That in itself is never a good reason, right? Just because it's popular in some shape or form is never a reason in itself to endorse the position or think it's true, a claim's true, or take up or do a certain thing, right? So, as I mentioned at the top of slide 9, this is another kind of mistaken appeal to popularity, and it's known as this bandwagon fallacy is another version of mistaken appeal to popularity, which occurs when someone tries, quote, to get us to do something by suggesting that everyone or most people are doing it, end quote. That's from 216 of the 13th edition. So, again, they're not actually offering legitimate support. Okay? They're just appealing to the fact that everyone already does it, already takes that position. Well, that in itself, again, is never, from a logician and critical thinker's perspective, never legitimate evidence. So, quoting page 216 there towards the bottom of slide 9, the fallacy happens when someone tries, quote, to induce us to do something by making us feel out of step with things if we don't, end quote. Reminds me a lot of the peer pressure fallacy too, right? So my example there at the bottom, where's your mohawk, dog? Look around you. Do you see one of us guys without one? The idea is you should have a mohawk. Why? Because everyone else has a mohawk. Right? Well, just because everyone else has a mohawk doesn't mean you should necessarily have a mohawk, right? So if someone implied that, they'd be guilty, as is the case here at the bottom, they'd be guilty of then the bandwagon fallacy. Okay, now we have concluded our discussion of mistaken appeal to popularity in general, and then those specific versions. We'll move on then to discuss. So these have to do with cause and effect, right? And we discussed cause-effect relationship again in this lecture at length, and explanations and so on. So these mistakes will have to do with that portion again of lecture 6, the cause and effect reasoning that we discussed again in that portion of lecture 6 in chapter 11. It's the kinds of mistakes we can make with respect to cause and effect reasoning. So we're going to cover 2 main types, post hoc and cum hoc, okay? And we will go through, in general, as I mentioned somewhere here coming up, you don't have to know like their particular variations that they mentioned of the post hoc and cum hoc, other than these 2. I do want you to be familiar with these 2, which fall best under post hoc here. Okay? But yeah, so they differentiated a few different versions under cum hoc, post hoc. Those other ones, don't worry about, okay, unless I'm drawing your explicit attention here to them. Right. So again, these are related to cause and effect reasoning. 2 different types, and we'll go through them in turn. We'll spend a lot more time because we have a few different versions. We want to spend more time discussing on post hoc, but we'll go through each of them in turn here. So the first one is technically post hoc ergo Propter hoc. Right? It's a longer, usually it's expressed as a longer Latin expression, which translates into English as after this, therefore because of this. And so the idea is, so, oops, imagine a timeline here. Right? Things are happening, different things are happening there. A happens, and then B happens, okay? And so after this, because of this, is post hoc ergo Propter hoc. That's what it translates at. And we'll get into what the mistake is and what exactly that means here in a moment, okay? But just wanted to mention that it does have that longer, typically, or sometimes, not usually actually, most of the time, I mentioned here somewhere, we'll abbreviate it in this way, and I would say most of the time you actually come across somebody referencing this fallacy is in this abbreviated sense. They don't usually say post hoc ergo Propter hoc, right? They'll say he was guilty of a post hoc. Right? And so we'll do the same, right? We're not going to reference these constantly as post hoc ergo Propter hoc. We'll just say post hoc or cum hoc. But I do, again, slide 10, drawing your attention to, they do have a not typically, but they do have a longer expression that we, again, use the shortened version of typically. So the second one will be cum hoc ergo Propter hoc, which is Latin for with this, therefore because of this. So in that instance, so we have these various points in time. Again, that's what these dashes are. And with cum hoc ergo Propter hoc, A and B are both happening at the same time. Okay. So whether this would be post and this would be cum hoc, and one way or another, just because of them happening in time, when they do, the person erroneously suggests there's a causal relationship at play, right? When they don't have evidence for it. Right? Just because things happen at certain points in time doesn't necessarily mean, right, that one caused the other. And to suggest or imply that is a mistake, which is what's happening here then. So we'll start with, what else do I say here? So this is the middle of slide 10, quoting page 217. Quote, both, that is both of these types here, assume that the timing of two variables relative to each other in and of itself is sufficient to establish that one is the cause and the other is the effect, end quote. No, we need to know more other than just when they occurred in terms of time. Okay. So there I said at the bottom, right, go ahead and use the abbreviated versions as I and most other people do. And this is something they don't explicitly draw out in this edition. I think they did in previous editions, but I think it's helpful to do it regardless. And talk about how what's going on here is problematic, and it boils down to sort of three different possibilities that people who commit these mistakes aren't acknowledging, right? In suggesting that there's automatically that causal relationship. So you can imagine, right? So let's say they're saying that A caused B. Right? Well, as I mentioned at the top of slide 11, look, that obviously, right? That could just be accidental or coincidental, okay? However you want to label it. So the connection between A and B could just be a coincidence. And no matter how many times it happens, right? Now that it's a coincidence, the more times we see B immediately following A, that it's coincidence or just due to chance, that becomes less and less probable. But you can't ever completely eliminate even that possibility, right? That relationship was just due to coincidence or chance. The second possibility that someone guilty of post hoc or cum hoc fallacies that they are oftentimes guilty of, is that, hey, look, maybe there's some other factor at play that's causing both of them each time they happen. But there's a third element, and so to say then that B was caused by A or that A caused B, that would be a mistake, because no, C caused both of them in all these different scenarios. So that's a second possibility that isn't acknowledged, and when someone automatically jumps to the conclusion, well, then A caused B. Okay? And then the third one doesn't apply to post hoc, right? Because nobody makes the mistake of, right, when they come in this direction, right, nobody assumes, well, B caused A if B came after A, right? But imagine, right, that somebody, when it comes to cum hoc, okay, they automatically assume, well, A caused B. Well, maybe, because these two things are happening at the same time, right? Well, maybe, no, it was B causing A each time. So, right, each time A happens, B happens. And they conclude, well, right, every time we see A, we see B, therefore A causes B. And the third possibility, or the type of thing that they might not be acknowledging, the third thing listed on the top of slide 11, is that no, maybe the other thing is causing A, right? B is causing A instead. So one example, I think I even referenced this one. No, I don't think I do in the notes actually, but they mention it in the text, right? Healthy people taking walks, right? So we always see, hey, those really healthy people, we always seeing them out on walks, taking walks, and so they conclude, right? Healthy people taking walks, healthy people taking walks, healthy people taking walks. So they conclude, health makes us walk, but maybe it's walking makes us healthy, right? Which one causes which? You know, they're always occurring at the same time. We don't necessarily know, and to assume that the one causes the other would be a mistake, right? Would be what we mean to indicate in this case is a Cum Hoc fallacy. So hopefully that makes some sense. Again, just because two things occur at certain points in time, in and of itself, doesn't give us license to infer then or conclude that there's a causal relationship at play. And to do so would be a mistake in one of those kinds of ways. So I mentioned the three kinds of possibilities in general, right, that aren't being acknowledged typically when someone's guilty of post hoc or Cum Hoc fallacies. And that was again on top of slide 11. The bottom of slide 11 is just mentioning what I already referenced earlier, that you don't need to worry about the different variations of post hoc and Cum Hoc that they cover in the text, other than these two particular ones, okay, which we will now go into. So, first we'll talk, turning to slide 12, about post hoc in general. Okay. As they mentioned, this is from the 10th edition, page 404. This fallacy entails thinking, quote, that the mere fact that one event preceded another event proves that the earlier event caused the later one. Okay, so I've already kind of alluded to this general mistake here. So the general form, A immediately preceded B. So we're going back to post hoc here. So we'll put up A, B, get the idea. Okay, so A immediately precedes B, so then they want us to infer, well, A caused B. Okay. But hey, that's not necessarily the case. Just because, again, something follows something else in time, and it doesn't matter how many times that's the case, doesn't mean that the thing that followed was caused by the thing that preceded it. Now, again, the more oftentimes we find them paired together in our experience, that makes the likelihood that it's just due to chance less, but still we can never eliminate the possibility that it's due to chance, right? And therefore we can never completely prove, right, that A caused B. So I like their examples. They gave some examples on 217. Now, so this one, I give the extreme, absurd example, the one we'd say obviously that's ridiculous, right? I think because it most obviously demonstrates what we mean by post hoc. But then, the other example they give is indicative of times where somebody says something and it's a lot less obvious that they're guilty of this kind of mistake. So the obvious example first, again from page 217, quote, after I played poker, my cold went away fast. Therefore, playing poker caused my cold to go away fast. So played poker, cold went away fast. So then they want to automatically assume, well, playing poker caused their cold to go away fast. Come on, that was just coincidental, we'd say, right? That's pretty obvious. But imagine someone said, my cold went away pretty fast after taking, Zicam or whatever their medicine. Okay. Now, given what we know about medicine, hey, we could infer maybe that there's some connection there, right? But we don't want to automatically, and it all depends on how strongly we form our conclusions, right? We can't automatically assume that just because our cold went away super fast after we took whatever medicine, that the medicine made it go away super fast. Maybe it was the fact that we also slept 10 hours right away, right? Maybe that had something to do with it, okay? So again, even in cases where it seems like, given our background knowledge, medicine, that does seem to be related to getting rid of colds. Even in those cases, though, we have to be careful, proceed cautiously. Maybe it was some other factor that actually, right, eliminated the colds super fast, and it wasn't the medicine. So that is, whoops, an example of post hoc in general, or post hoc ergo propter hoc. Turning to slide 13, then, I want to talk about one of the versions we come across of post hoc, and I think it's pretty common, which is why I wanted to discuss it. So recall our discussion of random variation again in lecture 6, the idea that even if you have a random sample, which we want in any study, right, when we're trying to ascertain something that's true of a population, we want a random sample so we can eliminate bias, right? But even when we get a random sample, as we discussed, there's going to be some random variation. And even when we have a random sample, we can't be 100% sure that what's true of that sample is going to be true of the general population, right? Because there will be some random variation. And so to sort of forget about that or lose sight of that, then would be what we need to indicate by overlooking the possibility of random variation. So as I mentioned, this is quoting pages 219 and 220. This quote instance of post hoc reasoning occurs when we ignore the fact that values of variables fluctuate randomly, 219, and quote, if you assume that this random fluctuation is due to causation, you make the mistake, end quote, page 220. So as I mentioned at the bottom there, the idea is that the time it takes us for us to do anything, right, that's going to vary from time to time, no matter what. And so we have to, again, appreciate that and not lose sight of that. So they gave some good examples. I forgot, again, the specifics, but it's like, so imagine something with golf, I think, and they were, driving off the tee, and you can take the same golfer, as they point out, and, say, hit the ball 10 times, we'll measure your driving range. And from one set of 10 drives to the next, the average is going to vary, right? And so, as they point out, advertisers will take advantage of this because they'll do things then like they'll find, right? They'll take all these different sets of 10, and then in between, right? They'll say apply whatever they want to try to market, this fancy bracelet, let's say, that's supposed to somehow help you athletically, and they'll administer it in between different sets of 10, and they'll find one where, for whatever reason, right, the golfer didn't do particularly well, like a lower average of 10. They'll find one where that was the case, and then directly followed by a set of 10 where it was higher than, right? And again, because the suggestion, what's going to be implied if the person, people that are hearing about this aren't critical thinkers, is that, hey, this gold bracelet, look what it did. Their averages improved dramatically, when in fact, all that was at play was just random variation. The fact that their averages are going to differ from one set of 10 to the next, right? That's just what happens over time, right? No matter what it is we're doing, there's always going to be some degree of randomness in it, right? So if we lose sight of that, if we let that sort of advertisement convince us that, hey, this bracelet really did improve their average driving range, or distance, I should say, we fall guilty of, again, overlooking the possibility of random variation. Okay, so I think that's all I have to say there. Turning then to slide 14, kind of a very similar sort of deal here, overlooking the possibility of regression. So here, as I mentioned at the top of slide 14, over time, statistical results are going to balance out, meaning that statistical anomalies or strange statistical situations, right, those are going to sort of be eliminated, right, and you're going to get results that come closer and closer to the mean. So you might, for example, if you're familiar with baseball stats, you might have heard of the expression, we can expect some positive regression. So in other words, let's say Joe Henry is a career 300 hitter, and so his career, maybe you don't know too much about baseball, but career hitting average is, and he's been playing a long time, right? So, hey, this career average, it has some weight to it, right? It's some significance, right? It wasn't based on a very small sample. And then this year, 2021 average, and we're in, especially for early on in the season, he's only hitting, let's say, 190, okay, well below his career average. Then you would hear you could hear pundits saying, you can express, I already forgot his name, Joe Henry, you can expect some positive regression from Joe Henry. And what they mean is, look, this isn't going to be likely to follow, right? Given what we know is the true average over time, what seems to be the true average for Joe Henry, we can expect, right, his performance after this, post this, to probably go up, right? We shouldn't expect his average to be near 0.190 at the conclusion. Let's say this was halfway through, right? At the conclusion of the season, we should expect a higher average than 0.190, okay? And to not expect that, right, or when we see, so not to expect that, right, we wouldn't, right, be adequately recognizing, right, regression to the mean, or alternatively, let's say at the end, 2021, good grief, he's hitting 0.220, and we're like, whoa, what did he do differently? Right? We would be guilty of overlooking the possibility of regression because we think, oh, he must have done something crazy, but no, that's just what was likely to happen, right? Given regression, right? Over time, things are likely to just even out. So another example I have is imagine two that I came up with. Bear with me here too as I flesh these examples out. Imagine two people. So person A and person B, or let's call them Tim and Joe. Tim and Joe. And Joe says, look, I have some superpowers when it comes to flipping quarters. I can make them turn heads up. And Tim goes, oh, whatever. Let's see. So they both agree to flip quarters 10 times. And Tim only flips 2 heads. And Joe flips, lo and behold, 6 heads. Well, we know, as critical thinkers, that you flip a quarter 10 times. Okay? We're not dealing with this weird quarter, right? Just straight facts, just a quarter. How many times, right, is it on average, all things considered, over time, what will be the average that it'll land heads? 5. Okay? And so let's say this happened first. And then this happened second, and we kind of weren't thinking critically, and all of a sudden we see, oh, this huge jump in Joe and being able to flip heads. We're like, oh my gosh, Joe does have this superpower. Wow, look how much more he was able to flip heads. No, right? We should have known as critical thinkers that was already likely to be the case, given that on average we could expect anyway, right, someone to just flip heads 5 times. Right? So this was just unusually low, right? So we shouldn't expect, right, what's just positive regression here. We shouldn't try to explain that positive regression by some other factor. Joe's superpower. To do so, again, would be an example of overlooking the possibility of regression. So as I put it, this is the second from the bottom bullet point on slide 14. The point here is that we shouldn't read too much into the fact that anomalies are followed by results that are closer to the average. This is simply what's bound to happen due to statistical regression. I'll give you another example down there. This is at the bottom. This is actually one they had in a previous edition, I think. We should not suspect some sort of causal reason when average height children are born to abnormally tall parents, right? So you have 2 super tall parents, then just average height kids. Sometimes people are like, what's going on there? Well, look, again, the parents were unusually tall. So all things being equal, the chances are they're going to have, kids that are closer to the average height. So that was slide 14. Moving on to slide 15. So that was our discussion of post hoc. We'll move on to Cum Hoc. As I mentioned on the top of slide 15, here the fallacy entails, quote, thinking that a correlation or covariation between 2 variables proves that one causes the other. Okay, so we'll switch this around again. And here it is, A and B always happen at the same time. And so the person's like, hey, A must be causing B. But as we mentioned, hey, there might be something else at play. Maybe B's causing A, okay? or maybe it's just coincidence that they are always happening together, or maybe there's some third thing, C, causing both in each instance, as we said. Okay? So, yeah, many ways we can be guilty of this sort of mistake, right? But in general, the mistake in general is assuming that just because two things happen at the same point in time, that one must have caused the other. So the general form, as I mentioned there, is A happened at the same time as B, therefore A caused B. Give you an example. Actually, this is their example from page 221. Quote, John had a heart attack while he was saying a prayer, therefore the prayer caused the heart attack. So A and B happened at the same time. Right? Said a prayer, had a heart attack, both happened at the same time. So they want to say, wait, maybe the prayer caused the heart attack. Maybe he started having a heart attack, right, and instantly started praying. Maybe it was the other way, right? Or maybe there's a third thing at play. And I gave you the example earlier in my discussion in general of this type of mistake, where, again, one that they discussed, where you see, for example, whenever you see people walking, they're healthy, walking healthy, walking healthy, walking healthy. And so then you infer, well, walking must make people healthy. Well, maybe it's being healthy leads people to walk, right? Who knows? Okay, or maybe there's a third factor that tends to cause both. Okay. Again, the point is, in general, you can't infer that there is a causal relationship between these two just because they happen at the same point in time. There might be, okay, but you don't have license to just automatically infer that causal relationship because they're happening at the same point in time. And that would be a mistake. Okay, so that is Cum Hoc. Moving right along then, probably another one that you've heard of, slippery slope. As I mentioned on the top of slide 16, the slippery slope fallacy occurs when someone says that X will lead to Y without sufficiently offering a reason to believe that it will. Okay, so X is going to lead to Y. Now maybe, right, if you provide the adequate evidence, just suggesting X will lead to Y isn't necessarily a mistake, but the idea is when we say someone's guilty of a slippery slope fallacy, they haven't adequately supported the idea that X will automatically lead to Y. So imagine someone says, if we legalize gambling, then before you know it, everything will be legalized. All right, so gambling, everything. I think that's a good example of a slippery slope fallacy, right? If somebody were to suggest that. You need to tell us why just by legalizing this one thing, that would spiral into legalizing everything being allowed. Okay, without providing any evidence, that's a huge leap, right? And so that would certainly be a mistake. I'll give you another example there towards the top of slide 16. Quote, this is my own example, but honey, if you decide not to mow the lawn this week, pretty soon you won't be mowing the lawn at all. Right? Don't mow the lawn this week. And then he or she says, well, if you don't mow the lawn this week, you'll never mow the lawn. Well, why does that necessarily follow, right? You need to give me some evidence, honey, why not mowing it this week means that I'll necessarily never mow it again. Also, I mentioned there towards the bottom of slide 16, second bullet point from the bottom, something I don't recall them, I just reread it this morning, I don't recall them actually mentioning this time around in this edition, but the slippery slope fallacy can occur, much like a false dilemma can occur in sort of different ways, or can be couched in different ways. You can come across a slippery slope fallacy worded in different ways as well, or sort of couched in a different way, let's put it that way. So, in other words, since X has already happened, well then we have to do Y. Okay, so since X has already taken place, the idea is, or since policy X has already been established, we have to kind of then accept, right, build off of that and do Y. Okay? That's what I'm getting at when I say, since X has already happened, taken place, then Y must also happen or take place. Okay? If you don't demonstrate, again, why, just because we've already done something, then this other subsequent action has to take place. If you don't, again, support that notion, that's a fallacy or mistake. And so the example, this is the one they gave actually when they discussed this in a previous edition. Common sort of version of this type of slippery slope is, after war has been started, okay, and this is the one I'm referencing at the bottom there. So, war has been started. Someone who says, well, we have to finish the job now, and we might as well deploy more to get that done. All right, so we already started the war. We have to then finish it and deploy as many resources as necessary now to make sure it's done. Well, you need to support that, right? Maybe it's the case that we made a mistake here by starting it, and maybe the proper thing to do is withdraw, right? Admit our mistake, withdraw, and not make a bad situation even worse. Okay, so that's a version of slippery slope to suggest, right, that because we've already done something, well, then we have to do something else. Okay? You still need to tell me why. Give us evidence why. Just because we've already done something to begin with, then this other thing should follow. Okay, so that's the bottom of slide 16. That's all we have for slippery slope. Finally, we'll discuss our last example or type of fallacy associated with inductive reasoning, and that is what's known as untestable explanation. So as they mention on page 224, this is the top of slide 17, we should reject causal explanations that can't be tested. And quote, when someone offers an explanation that could not be tested even in principle, he or she is said to commit the fallacy of untestable explanation, end quote. So again, that's from page 224. So if they're, again, we're talking about cause and effect sort of relationship, going back to lecture 6, material in lecture 6 in chapter 11. Okay, and somebody offers us a causal explanation. The idea here is, and in that explanation, we wouldn't either know what it would mean to, one way or another, we don't have the means to test whether or not, right, to even figure out whether or not what they're suggesting, the explanation, the hypothesis, is true or not. There's no means of testing it, hence it's untestable. That's a problem. Anybody that offers us an explanation that we have no recourse or no means to figure out whether it's correct or not, right? That's a mistake on their part. So as I mentioned right off the bat, okay, and this isn't something I don't think they necessarily, at least they didn't emphasize this part. Meaningless explanations. They did kind of allude to, I guess, vague, right, issues with explanations that hinge on, I forgot their example, but vague terms, which is kind of what I'm getting at in my example of a meaningless explanation here. So this is the middle of slide 17. Imagine somebody, and this actually goes off of an example they talked about in a previous edition, explaining why butlers with English accents are paid more. So they're trying to explain why butlers with English accents are paid more. And they suggest, well, it's because they give off good vibes. This is what we mean to suggest by an untestable explanation. That's essentially a meaningless explanation. What does good vibes even mean? Right? We could debate that endlessly. Therefore, to suggest that that's why they get paid more, it's a mistake, right? I mean, how would you defend it? How could we test it? We can't, right? So you might as well have said just complete nonsense, right? Because they booga, right? We can't test that either, and you can't defend it either. So again, meaningless expressions like that, explanations that we don't even know what it mean, right? We don't even know what having good vibes would look like. So how could we test whether or not it's true they have good vibes? And that's the point at the very bottom of 17. And then, so obviously meaningless explanations, right? Ones where we wouldn't even know what it would mean for it to be true or false. That's an issue. But then also it's an issue if we would know, let's say, what it would mean for it to be true or false, but we have no means or way of actually testing it. Well, that's still a problem, right? So practically speaking, so the idea is it's not conceptually difficult, right? We know what is meant, but practically there's the difficulty when we have no way of testing it still. That's equally problematic for a critical thinker. And so we need to be on guard against these kinds of explanations as well. So, for example, explanations that refer to an afterlife. If somebody tries to explain a phenomenon by appealing to an afterlife, how are we as critical thinkers, how do we do anything with that kind of explanation? There's no way we could test it. Okay? So from our perspective as critical thinkers, we can't do anything with it. And we would identify it as a kind of mistake if they were trying to suggest that that explanation is adequate. As I mentioned, okay, underneath that, also be on guard against circular explanations. A lot of times sometimes these are pretty obvious, and then when they are, right, I mean, it's clear there's a mistake. But sometimes then they're not as obvious, and so they can be a little bit more confusing in those instances. So a clear example, page 395 of the 10th edition. Why is the floor wet? And so, they're trying to explain why is the floor wet, and somebody says because there's water on it. That's just restating that it's wet, right? I mean, it's not offering an actual explanation at all. And so then I mentioned one that's maybe, so that on the face of it seemed absurd, right? If somebody were to explain why the floor is wet by saying there's water on it, we'd be like, well, you haven't really given me any explanation. The toilet screwed up, or what's going on. So right, we would have a problem with that. Clearly, right? It's a much more obvious example. But then there are cases where we're offered circular explanations where it's maybe not near as obvious. So imagine somebody saying something like, "Why do I think the death penalty is wrong? Because it's not okay to punish someone with death." Right? So they're explaining why the death penalty is wrong by suggesting that it's not okay to kill someone, not okay to punish someone with death, which is what the death penalty is, right? So they're just saying it's wrong because it's wrong. Right? Again, not really explaining why it's wrong, you're just restating that it's wrong. Right? Hence, that's why it's circular. And so you're not really offering an explanation at all in that sense. Okay? And in that sense, then it's an untestable explanation, as they suggest. So that is the bottom of slide 18. And with that, I think we have finished our account of at least the fallacies we want to cover with respect to inductive reasoning. We've gone through all the major headings here and some of the various subversions or subtypes, if you will, of these different kinds. So hopefully most of those made sense. I don't think there's anything, like I suggested earlier, too overly difficult about any of these. Again, their sheer number can be a little bit overwhelming when you're first jumping into this, but again, practice, and I don't think there's too much to worry about here. So this does conclude, again, our discussion of induction fallacy. So all that remains at this point in the course, right, is the last lecture. Hold back your tears. I know it's going to be difficult. You only have one more lecture, one more video to get your fix of logic and critical thinking, and then it's over. But don't worry. I'll probably offer a conclusion video where I'll point you in various directions to continue getting your philosophical fix if you need it in the future. But we are almost done with the course. We only have one more lecture then, lecture 12, where we'll finish the final section, the fourth section, our discussion of fallacies. We'll turn our attention to what I titled the lecture, Other Fallacies, right? Basically all the other kinds of mistakes we can make as logicians and critical thinkers that weren't discussed in these previous two lectures, right? Our lecture 11 and lecture 10. So in particular, we'll discuss a lot of formal fallacies, what are known as formal fallacies, mistakes associated with the underlying form of the arguments that are given, and then a lot of mistakes associated with language. So that's what we have to look forward to in the next lecture, in the final lecture, lecture 12. And that'll be it then. So again, that's it for lecture 11. Offered you a little bit of a preview there in terms of what to expect in the next lecture. So wanted to mention one last time, I guess, lecture 11 corresponds to, again, chapter 7. So your chapter 7 homework here, I'll leave you with that. Next time I see you again, we'll discuss chapter 8. And we'll talk in lecture 12 about other fallacies then. Thank you.